Lucas Malone never thought something as routine as parking his work truck could spiral into the worst conflict of his professional life. It had been an exhausting Friday afternoon, the kind that made your shoulders ache and your mind blur with numbers, measurements, and endless client emails. Lucas, a hardworking owner of a small but reputable home restoration company, had finally wrapped up a week of site visits and material deliveries. Pulling into the shared lot behind the old commercial building where his office was located, he instinctively steered into the same open spot he used every day for the past 3 years. The asphalt still bore the faded outlines of old parking spaces, and though someone had recently attempted to repaint a few lines with sloppy yellow brushstrokes, the organization of the lot remained chaotic at best. Lucas parked neatly, killed the engine, and leaned back against the headrest for a moment, savoring the silence after a long day's work. That peace lasted about 10 seconds. A dark blue SUV screeched around the corner and slammed to a halt directly behind his truck. The driver's door flung open with such force that it bounced back, and out stormed a woman who seemed to fill the entire space between the vehicles. She wore an overly tight floral blouse stretched across her considerable frame, and a pair of thick black sunglasses perched on a nose that pointed at Lucas like an accusation. Without even closing her car door, she marched toward him, arms flailing dramatically. "Are you blind or just ignorant?" she barked, her voice a shrill whip crack across the otherwise empty lot. Lucas, still half in his seat, blinked in confusion. "This is a reserved spot, pal. Been mine for years. Paid for and everything." Lucas, choosing calm over confrontation, stepped out and closed his door carefully before facing her. He kept his tone even. "There are no reserved signs posted, ma'am, and management has never assigned spots here. It's first come, first served." The woman, who would later be infamously known to him as Karen Miller, planted her fists on her hips, causing her entire upper body to shift like a loaded ship at sea. "You think you can just park anywhere because you drive that monstrosity? This is a professional complex, not a construction site," she spat, waving a manicured hand toward his slightly dusty but meticulously maintained work truck. Lucas sighed internally. He had dealt with difficult clients, stubborn suppliers, even the occasional drunk neighbor. But there was something different about this woman's intensity. It wasn't about the parking spot. It was about control. He decided disengagement was the wiser choice. "I'm sorry you feel that way, but I'm not moving. You're welcome to talk to building management if there's an issue," he said, keeping his voice measured but firm. Karen's face flushed crimson. She muttered something under her breath, something that sounded suspiciously like a threat, then spun on her heel, stomping back toward her SUV without bothering to close her driver's side door, letting it hang open like a challenge. Lucas shook his head, grabbed his clipboard, and headed toward the building entrance, thinking it was nothing more than a blowhard moment that would be forgotten by Monday. He had no idea that Karen wasn't the kind of person who forgot, or forgave, what she considered a slight. As he disappeared inside, Karen remained by her SUV, staring at his truck with a dark, calculating look, her jaw grinding side to side. Something ugly had been set in motion, and Lucas Malone was about to find himself in a battle far nastier than anything he could have imagined. The weekend passed without incident, and by Monday morning, Lucas had nearly forgotten the unpleasant encounter in the parking lot. He had bigger things to focus on: a kitchen renovation deadline, 2 pending invoices that needed to be chased down, and a supplier that had inexplicably delivered the wrong type of reclaimed wood. As he pulled into the lot, the early sun glinting off his windshield, Lucas felt a sense of cautious optimism that maybe the Karen situation had blown over. There were plenty of difficult people in the world who just needed to vent their frustrations once before moving on. Unfortunately, Lucas was about to learn that Karen Miller wasn't one of them. He parked in the same spot, squared between the faded lines, grabbed his coffee and folder from the passenger seat, and stepped out. The air was crisp, and he savored the moment as he adjusted his jacket and turned toward the office door. Then he heard the roar of an engine behind him. He barely had time to turn before he saw the SUV, that same massive blue monstrosity, barreling toward him. For a split second he froze, thinking she must have lost control, but the way the vehicle lined up perfectly with the side of his truck told a different story. With a bone-jarring crunch, the SUV rammed into the side of Lucas's work truck, the impact so violent that it shoved the heavy vehicle a few feet sideways. The SUV rocked back slightly, then revved again, as if Karen was about to drive straight through him. Lucas instinctively leapt back toward the curb, coffee flying from his hand, heart hammering against his ribs. A few startled employees from nearby offices poked their heads out, drawn by the noise. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Karen's SUV sat crooked, its bumper now intimately merged with the crumpled side of Lucas's truck. Karen herself emerged from the driver's seat, straightening her massive handbag on her shoulder like she had simply bumped a shopping cart in a parking lot. She glanced over at Lucas, her mouth curling into a tight, smug smile. "Well," she said, her voice artificially sweet, "maybe next time you'll think twice about stealing what doesn't belong to you." Lucas stared at her, incredulous. "You just rammed my truck. You could have killed someone." His voice was low, barely contained. The rage surged hot in his blood, but he knew better than to let it explode outward. People were watching. This had to be handled the right way. Karen snorted dismissively and pulled out her phone, snapping pictures of the scene with exaggerated care, as if documenting evidence for an insurance claim. Lucas retrieved his own phone, not to argue but to call the police. If Karen thought she could bully her way out of responsibility, she was about to learn how wrong she was. The officer arrived within 15 minutes, a tall, middle-aged man with the weary look of someone who had seen far too many ridiculous disputes. Karen immediately launched into a shrill narrative about how Lucas had blocked her reserved spot, how she had no choice but to nudge his vehicle, and how she feared for her safety. Lucas kept his responses short, factual, and devoid of emotion. He pointed out the lack of any reserved signage, the absence of assigned spots on the lease, and the visible damage on his truck, which clearly indicated that it had been stationary when struck. The officer listened to both sides with detached professionalism, jotting notes, examining the vehicles, and eventually turning to one of the bystanders who had witnessed the entire spectacle from the safety of a nearby doorway. The witness, a young woman with a badge identifying her as an employee of a logistics company upstairs, confirmed Lucas's version of events without hesitation. She gunned it straight into his truck. "He wasn't even near his vehicle when it happened," the woman said, her voice steady. Karen's mouth flapped open, searching for a rebuttal, but none came. The officer issued her a citation for reckless driving and property damage, and Lucas was advised to file an insurance claim immediately. As the officer finished his paperwork, Karen slumped against her SUV, her earlier bravado crumbling into a mask of seething resentment. Lucas didn't gloat. He didn't throw out a sarcastic remark or smirk triumphantly. Instead, he gathered his damaged clipboard, retrieved his scattered paperwork from the ground, and returned to his battered truck. As he climbed inside and carefully pulled away, the full weight of what had just happened settled heavily on him. His work truck wasn't just a vehicle, it was the backbone of his business. Losing time meant losing contracts. Losing contracts meant losing income. This wasn't just an irritating inconvenience. It was an attack on his livelihood. What Lucas didn't realize yet was that Karen's vendetta had only just begun. The collision was only the opening shot in a campaign of harassment and manipulation that would stretch the limits of his patience, his resources, and his faith in the system. She wasn't finished, not by a long shot. And Lucas, whether he liked it or not, was now at the center of a fight he never asked for but could not afford to lose. Lucas wasted no time after the crash. The moment he reached his office, still shaken but focused, he called his insurance company to report the accident. He knew the damage to his truck wasn't just cosmetic. The side panel was crushed, the door barely opened, and he could already feel the suspension was off as he had driven away. Every minute that vehicle stayed unusable was a threat to his contracts, deadlines, and reputation. The claims agent on the phone sounded sympathetic but non-committal, promising to open a case file and assign an adjuster within a few business days. Lucas, understanding how insurance companies operated, didn't rely on vague assurances. He immediately scheduled an independent mechanic to document the damages and provide an estimate, refusing to wait around for bureaucratic sluggishness that could cost him critical jobs. The estimate was brutal. Nearly $12,000 in repairs, a 2-week turnaround time, and recommendations for a complete realignment of the frame. Lucas felt a pit forming in his stomach. Renting a comparable vehicle in the meantime would cost another $2,000 easily, money he hadn't budgeted for this quarter. Still, he pushed forward. He authorized the repairs, arranged for a rental, and started drafting a formal claim against Karen Miller for damages not covered by insurance, just as his attorney, Doug Foster, had advised. Doug, a seasoned property and liability attorney, didn't mince words when Lucas laid out the situation. "You're doing everything right," he said, leaning back in his leather office chair, steepling his fingers. "But understand this. People like her, they don't back down because they were wrong. They double down because they got caught." Doug recommended filing a personal injury notice as well, Not because Lucas was actually hurt, he wasn't, but to preempt any dirty tricks Karen might pull later, trying to flip the narrative in her favor. Lucas hesitated at first, uncomfortable with the idea of playing offense when he saw himself as a victim simply trying to repair the damage. But Doug was persuasive. "You're not looking for a payday. You're protecting yourself. If you don't push back hard now, she'll think you're an easy target." As the repairs got underway and the paperwork was filed, Lucas tried to move on with his projects. He kept his head down, focused on the renovations he had lined up, and tried not to think about Karen Miller. For a few days, he allowed himself the belief that maybe, just maybe, the confrontation was over. He was wrong. It started subtly. Lucas returned to the parking lot one afternoon after a supplier meeting and found a bright orange ticket slapped on his rented truck's windshield, claiming he had parked illegally. Confused, Lucas scanned the ticket and realized it wasn't issued by the city. It was from some third-party parking enforcement company he had never heard of. The company name printed at the bottom looked suspiciously amateur, and when Lucas called the number listed, he got a voicemail that simply said, "Leave a message." No operator, no menu, no legal disclaimers. Red flags everywhere. The following day, another ticket appeared. Then another. Lucas spoke to the building's front desk, demanding to know if the property had changed parking policies. The receptionist, a timid young man who looked uncomfortable even making eye contact, finally admitted that Karen Miller had volunteered to coordinate a parking improvement program after receiving complaints about work trucks taking up prime spaces. Lucas felt a burning anger ignite inside him, but he kept it contained. He thanked the receptionist tersely and walked out before saying something he'd regret. Later that evening, Doug filed a cease and desist letter against the fraudulent ticketing company, demanding they immediately halt all contact with Lucas and his property under threat of legal action. Doug also sent a separate letter to the property management group, formally putting them on notice that if any further harassment continued, they could be implicated as complicit. Lucas installed a dashboard camera in his rental truck, not to record casual moments, but as evidence, if needed, for insurance or court. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was self-defense. Every day he parked at his office now felt like stepping onto a battlefield. It didn't help that the mood inside the building shifted too. People who once greeted him warmly now gave him sidelong glances, whispered behind hands, or avoided him entirely. Rumors, clearly seeded by Karen, began circulating that Lucas had been aggressive, disruptive, even dangerous. One evening, after a particularly long day of replacing rotten joists in a client's Victorian-era home, Lucas trudged to his rental truck and found something new, a key scratch running the length of the driver's side door, deep and deliberate. He leaned against the truck for a moment, breathing deeply through his nose to keep the fury in check. This wasn't random vandalism. This was personal, and he knew exactly who was behind it. Lucas filed another police report, documenting the damage, but he knew how these things worked. Without direct evidence or a witness, there would be no arrests, no citations, just another page in a growing file. But what Karen didn't realize was that every incident, every petty act of sabotage, was strengthening Lucas's legal case against her. Doug had already begun building a civil harassment case in parallel to the property damage claim, and every ticket, scratch, and fraudulent complaint was ammunition. As the weeks stretched on, Lucas found himself forced into a kind of defensive rhythm: arrive, document, photograph, record, leave. It was exhausting and dehumanizing, and it drained him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He didn't want to live like this. Didn't want to be the guy who had to armor himself just to go to work. But there was no choice now. Karen had made it a war of attrition, and Lucas, stubborn to the core, refused to be the one to break first. Doug, ever pragmatic, reminded him at every step, "You're winning every move she makes. It doesn't feel like it now, but every new incident just buries her deeper. Patience, Lucas. Let her hang herself." Some nights, sitting in the half-lit office with a takeout box growing cold on the desk beside him, Lucas wondered if it was worth it. Fighting a battle you never asked for had a way of corroding you from the inside out. But when he thought about everything he had built, everything he stood to lose if he let her bully him into submission, his resolve hardened. He wasn't just fighting for his truck or his reputation. He was fighting for his right to exist without being crushed under someone else's arrogance and entitlement. He was fighting to show people like Karen Miller that not everyone would roll over and take it. Some people fought back, and some people won. Lucas had always believed that persistence would eventually beat injustice. But as the days dragged into weeks and the harassment only grew more calculated, Even his unwavering determination began to fray at the edges. Despite the mounting evidence he and Doug had carefully collected, Karen Miller seemed emboldened rather than deterred, expanding her campaign of petty cruelty into something more organized, almost methodical. The fake parking tickets multiplied, appearing not only on Lucas's rental truck, but also on the vehicles of visiting clients, an obvious attempt to damage his business relationships. Anonymous complaints flooded the property manager's inbox, accusing Lucas of noise violations, unsafe work practices, and, bizarrely, creating an unwelcoming environment for other tenants. Most absurdly, Karen even managed to convince one of the building's part-time maintenance workers to file a grievance claiming Lucas had verbally intimidated him, an accusation so false and absurd that even the management company seemed hesitant to take it seriously. Still, it had an effect. The steady drip of accusations, the whispers in the halls, the cold shoulders from formerly friendly neighbors. It all accumulated like layers of dust, choking the atmosphere around Lucas, until even simple tasks felt heavy. Doug continued filing counter notices and documenting everything meticulously, but legal wheels turned slowly, and Karen knew it. She was banking on wearing Lucas down long before anything meaningful happened in court. It nearly worked. The breaking point came not with a crash or a confrontation, but a letter. Lucas returned to his office late one Friday to find an envelope slid under the door bearing the unmistakable logo of the property management firm. Inside was a formal notice of non-renewal. His lease, which was up for renewal in 2 months, would not be extended. No explanation given, no chance for appeal. After 3 years of paying on time, maintaining his space impeccably, and even volunteering for minor repairs in the building, Lucas was being quietly forced out. He sat down heavily in his worn desk chair, the letter crumpled in his hand. For a long time, he simply stared at the floor, stunned. This was it, the culmination of Karen's vendetta, not through direct assault, but by poisoning the environment until Lucas had nowhere left to stand. His first instinct was to march upstairs, find Karen, and unleash every ounce of rage he had bottled up inside him. But he didn't move. Instead, he reached for his phone and called Doug. Doug listened silently as Lucas read the letter aloud. When he finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line before Doug spoke, his voice cool and deliberate. "They just handed us a gift," he said. "This, combined with everything else, is textbook retaliation. It's going to hurt them far more than it hurts you." It was the first time in weeks that Lucas allowed himself to hope. Doug explained that retaliation, the act of punishing someone for asserting their legal rights, was a serious offense in civil court. If they could prove that the non-renewal was connected to Lucas's ongoing claims and complaints, the property owners could be liable for substantial damages. Karen might have won a small battle by forcing him out of the building, but in doing so, she had opened a door Lucas hadn't even realized was there. Invigorated, Lucas and Doug doubled down. Doug subpoenaed internal communications from the property management company, seeking any trace of discussions related to Lucas's tenancy. Simultaneously, Doug filed an amended complaint adding charges of harassment, defamation, and retaliatory eviction against both Karen personally and the management firm. The lawsuit wasn't just about the truck anymore. It had become something larger, a statement against the kind of toxic behavior that too often thrived behind passive-aggressive smiles and manufactured grievances. Still, Lucas understood that legal victories took time, and in the meantime, he needed to survive. He began discreetly scouting for new office spaces, avoiding open advertisement of his plans to prevent Karen from interfering. He expanded his client base outward, reaching into neighboring towns where his reputation hadn't been tainted by gossip. His current clients, those who truly knew him, remained loyal and even sympathetic, quietly spreading word-of-mouth recommendations that kept his schedule full despite Karen's best efforts. One afternoon, while reviewing potential lease agreements for a new workspace, Lucas received a call from Doug that changed everything. "We got lucky," Doug said without preamble. "One of the junior property managers just handed over a batch of emails during discovery. Karen's name is all over them." Doug read aloud snippets of the emails, Karen complaining about trouble tenants, pushing for Lucas's lease to be terminated, accusing him baselessly of bringing down property value and scaring off prospective renters. There it was, in black and white proof that Karen had orchestrated the non-renewal, proof that the property managers had acted on her urging without evidence or justification. Lucas leaned back in his chair, a slow smile creeping across his face for the first time in weeks. This wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. But for the first time since Karen had smashed her SUV into his truck, Lucas felt the shift subtle but undeniable of momentum turning in his favor. The battle he never wanted had escalated beyond parking spots and scratched paint. It had become a fight for dignity, for reputation, for the right to stand your ground against those who thought they could bulldoze through life by sheer volume and venom. Lucas wasn't just surviving anymore, he was preparing to win. With the evidence piling up against her and the legal noose tightening day by day, Karen Miller responded in the only way people like her knew how, by escalating her tactics from petty harassment to open sabotage. She no longer bothered hiding her hostility behind fake politeness or anonymous complaints. Instead, her moves grew bolder, sloppier, fueled by desperation rather than calculation. Lucas noticed the shift almost immediately. The first sign was the sudden cancellation of a major project he had lined up with a commercial client located 2 blocks away from his office. The cancellation email was terse and formal, citing concerns about public reputation and recent incidents involving your business. Lucas knew exactly whose hand had guided that decision, but without hard proof linking Karen to the client's sudden change of heart, there was nothing he could do, yet. Not long after that, Lucas's supplier deliveries started getting mysteriously rerouted. Lumber orders arrived late or to the wrong address entirely. When Lucas called the supplier to complain, they sheepishly admitted they had received multiple updated instructions for his account, supposedly authorized by him. It took Lucas days to untangle the chaos, but eventually, through persistent cross-checking and recorded conversations, he gathered enough circumstantial evidence to show that someone had been impersonating him, submitting fraudulent change requests. Although it wasn't ironclad proof against Karen, the timing and nature of the interference aligned too perfectly with her previous behavior to be coincidence. Doug, methodical as ever, began adding each new incident to their growing lawsuit. He warned Lucas that Karen's escalating recklessness could actually work to their advantage if they documented everything properly. Still, the practical consequences weighed heavily. Every disrupted delivery, every lost client, every hour wasted fighting against invisible sabotage chipped away at Lucas's bottom line. He wasn't operating from a place of luxury. Every dollar mattered, and Karen's attacks were costing him real money he could not afford to lose. One evening, well after dark, Lucas returned to his truck after visiting a job site to find something chilling. Someone had slashed all 4 of his tires, not just punctured them, but savagely carved them open, leaving deep, ragged wounds in the rubber. A crude note had been tucked under the windshield wiper, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "You're not welcome here. Get out before it's too late." Lucas stood there for a long moment, the cool night air biting at his skin, the streetlights throwing long shadows across the ruined tires. He wasn't easily rattled, but this was different. This wasn't passive-aggressive parking tickets or whispered rumors. This was a direct, physical threat. And it terrified him not because he feared for his own safety, but because he knew where unchecked hatred could lead. He called the police immediately, filed another report, and arranged for a tow truck to remove his disabled vehicle. The responding officer, a young man with sharp eyes and a cautious demeanor, took the incident seriously but admitted, with a grimace, that without witnesses or camera footage, it would be difficult to prosecute anyone. The next day, Doug filed an emergency motion to amend their lawsuit again, this time including charges of intimidation and malicious interference with business operations. The judge, who had grown visibly impatient with the increasingly grotesque picture emerging from the case file, granted the motion without hesitation. More importantly, the judge authorized an expedited discovery process, allowing Doug to subpoena surveillance footage from the surrounding businesses. And then, finally, they caught a break. Footage from a liquor store across the street captured a blurry but unmistakable image. Karen's massive blue SUV parked just out of sight from Lucas's truck late that evening, and a figure matching her build waddling around the vehicle before quickly retreating. It wasn't the clearest video, but it was enough. When combined with the timing, the known hostility, and the pattern of escalating attacks, it created a devastating mosaic of circumstantial evidence. Doug's voice practically crackled with satisfaction when he called Lucas. "She's done," he said simply. "She just doesn't know it yet." But Karen, perhaps sensing that her empire of petty cruelty was crumbling, didn't go quietly. 2 days after Doug filed the new evidence with the court, Lucas received a certified letter hand-delivered by a private courier. Inside was a formal settlement offer written in the most sugary legalese imaginable. Karen offered to mutually withdraw all complaints and actions if Lucas agreed to drop his lawsuit and sign a non-disclosure agreement preventing him from speaking publicly about the case. There was no offer of financial restitution. no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just a cold attempt to erase her mistakes and walk away untouched. Lucas didn't even hesitate. He refused the offer through Doug, rejecting any suggestion of compromise. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about principle, about refusing to let bullies like Karen rewrite reality through intimidation and cowardice. Doug, ever the strategist, smiled when Lucas made his decision. "Good," he said, "because we're about to bury her so deep she'll need a map to find her way out." As the court date approached, the final preparations came together. Doug assembled witness statements, damage assessments, financial records showing lost revenue, and psychological evaluations from a licensed counselor detailing the stress and anxiety Lucas had endured. Every piece of evidence was meticulously organized, each one driving another nail into Karen's crumbling facade. Lucas, exhausted but grimly determined, knew that the coming trial wasn't just about recovering his losses. It was about standing in front of a judge, in front of Karen, and refusing to be erased. It was about proving, once and for all, that sometimes decency and persistence could triumph over cruelty and entitlement. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was ready. The morning of the trial arrived heavy with a sense of finality that Lucas could feel in his bones. As he stepped into the courthouse, dressed in a simple but sharp gray suit, he felt the weight of every sleepless night, every scratched truck door, every whispered lie. Doug was already waiting inside, calm and focused as ever, his briefcase stuffed with meticulously prepared evidence. Lucas nodded to him silently, both men knowing that the next few hours would determine the outcome of the nightmare that had engulfed Lucas's life for the past several months. Karen Miller entered shortly after, wearing a bulky navy pantsuit that seemed almost to exaggerate her already massive frame. She moved with an aggressive swagger, glancing around the room with that same entitled sneer she had worn on the day she first screamed at him in the parking lot. Her attorney, a frazzled-looking man who looked as though he had drawn the short straw at his firm, struggled to keep up as Karen barked instructions at him under her breath. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman with no tolerance for theatrics, wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. Opening arguments were brief. Doug's tone was direct and icy, laying out the pattern of harassment, the escalation from property damage to intimidation, the retaliation through the lease cancellation, and the mountain of circumstantial and physical evidence. Karen's lawyer stumbled through a disjointed defense, painting Lucas as confrontational and difficult, but lacking any actual proof. He tried to downplay the SUV collision as a parking misunderstanding and waved off the tire slashing as unrelated vandalism. But every time he tried to discredit Lucas's character, Doug calmly produced another witness statement. Another, surveillance still, another invoice showing financial damage. Slowly, methodically, the picture became clear to everyone in the room. Karen wasn't a victim. She was a vindictive bully who had let her rage spiral out of control. The most damning moment came when Doug presented the liquor store footage. Though the image was grainy, the judge studied it carefully as Doug narrated the events. Karen's SUV lurking just out of frame, the figure matching her body type moving suspiciously around Lucas's truck, the timing matching perfectly with the slashed tires discovered hours later. Karen's lawyer objected, citing the footage's low quality, but the judge waved him off. Circumstantial evidence becomes compelling, she said, when it aligns with a documented pattern of behavior. Karen's turn to testify was a disaster from the start. She entered the witness stand like a queen ascending a throne, but within minutes her story began to unravel under Doug's relentless questioning. She contradicted herself about the nature of the parking dispute, first claiming she had no issue with Lucas personally, then admitting she found his kind of business disruptive and distasteful. She denied sending complaints to the property management company, only for Doug to pull printed emails bearing her name and timestamps. She tried to blame the tire slashing on random teenagers, but when asked why her SUV was spotted near the scene that same night, she had no answer, only a stuttering mess of half-formed excuses. By the time Doug calmly played a recorded voicemail that Karen had left for one of Lucas's clients, telling them to think twice about associating with low-class contractors, the mood in the courtroom had shifted entirely. Even Karen's own lawyer looked resigned, sinking deeper into his chair as the case against his client collapsed under the weight of her own arrogance. Lucas watched it all unfold with a strange detachment, like observing a storm finally burn itself out after so many months of destructive rage. When closing arguments finished, the judge did not call for a recess. She delivered her verdict right then and there, her voice firm and without hesitation. Karen Miller was found liable for property damage, harassment, defamation, and retaliatory interference with business operations. She was ordered to pay Lucas a total of $60,000 in damages, covering not only the cost of repairs and lost business, but also punitive damages for the emotional and reputational harm caused by her deliberate actions. Karen's face twisted into a mask of disbelief, her mouth opening and closing without words. Lucas didn't look at her as he stood with Doug to thank the judge. He didn't need to. She was finished, crushed not by some grand act of revenge, but by her own relentless cruelty, documented piece by piece, until the truth stood so plainly that even she couldn't shout it away. As Lucas exited the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, a strange lightness filled him. Not the giddy high of victory, but the quieter, sturdier satisfaction of having endured, of having fought back against something ugly without letting it drag him down into its level. Doug clapped him on the shoulder once, a rare show of emotion from the stoic attorney, before heading off to file the paperwork that would finalize the damages. Lucas walked toward his newly repaired truck, the tires firm against the asphalt, the body shining like a badge of survival. For the first time in months, he wasn't looking over his shoulder, wasn't wondering what new trap Karen might have set. The war was over. She had lost everything, and he had kept the only thing that truly mattered, his integrity. The weeks following the verdict passed in a strange kind of silence, a quiet aftershock that Lucas welcomed more than he ever thought he would. Word of Karen Miller's defeat spread quickly throughout the building and the local business community. People who had once kept their distance now approached Lucas with nods of respect or brief words of congratulations, though he rarely engaged beyond a polite thank you. He wasn't interested in rehashing the battle. The point had never been to win admiration or to relish in Karen's downfall. It had been about reclaiming peace, about standing firm when it would have been easier to walk away. Karen, meanwhile, faded from the landscape almost overnight. Her SUV was gone from the lot by the end of the week. Her office, previously filled with towering stacks of garish decorations and boxes of promotional materials for whatever schemes she had been running, stood empty, the windows covered with brown butcher paper. Rumor had it she had tried to find new space in a neighboring complex but was turned away, her reputation preceding her like a warning flare. Lucas didn't spare her much thought. She was no longer part of his story. With the damages awarded, Lucas invested in a brand new truck, a sturdy model built for heavier work and harsher conditions. It gleamed under the midday sun as he loaded tools into the back, a tangible symbol of survival and persistence. He found a new office space across town, a modest but clean storefront with a small workshop behind it, run by a management company that, as he made sure to verify, valued transparency and fairness. The move was bittersweet. He had built memories in his old space, but leaving behind the battlefield felt right, like shedding the last traces of a fight that had tried so hard to define him. One late afternoon, standing outside his new office, Lucas watched the sunset burn across the sky in deep oranges and purples, casting long shadows across the street. For the first time in a long time, he felt not just relieved, but truly at ease. No lingering tension, no waiting for the next punch to land. Just the simple, powerful knowledge that he had faced the storm and come through it not broken, but stronger. He had proven that sometimes the best revenge wasn't vengeance at all. It was rebuilding your life so solidly that the ones who tried to tear you down ended up buried under the weight of their own failure. Without a backward glance, Lucas turned, locked up the shop, and headed home, the sun setting behind him and a new chapter waiting just beyond the horizon.